program is designed for a small group of specially invited personal friends of the house. So please, if you sit in the back and need a kind of closer relationship with the panel, come forward and sort of sit in the front. I'm very grateful that Vinton Cerf accepted again our cordial invitation to come to this house, and in a way has become an initial for the beginning of our science festival. But it is more than that. He has been a friend and a mediator bridge between Heidelberg and its passion for America, particularly for science that occurs in America. So our sister citizenship with Palo Alto, in a way, is embodied by today's program. In late news, we learned that Germany is a late bloomer in terms of digitalization. And that's why we address this issue again and again in our festival. And you may have listened more carefully to this year's General Secretary of the United Nations, where Mr. Antonio Guterres was blaming the new technologies for being responsible for hate speech, for disinformation, and many other equally bad influences on our world. And he said, the hope can only be and become through dialogue and debate. Mm-hmm. Now, we have in Germany, we have a philosopher who is now over 90 years old, and he really dominates somehow our discussion of the public. Jürgen Habermas. He just published a kind of remake or an updated version of his best-selling book of the structural change of the public. And there he concludes, the problem of internet is that it kills dialogue and debate. Exactly what Mr. Guterres asked for. You can imagine this happened the last few days. It's somehow sort of the background of tonight's discussion. We know that the evangelist Vinton Cerf has a very personal view and perception of the advantages and the risks of the new technologies. And we hope for some clarifying understanding of this. And in a way, the guarantee for this kind of hope is our moderator, Ralf Kühnel. You probably know the institution he stands for, Rhein-Neckar-Fernsehen, much better than himself, but he's the big man behind it. So he will create all that kind of parameters for the solutions, the insights we are looking for tonight. We have another interesting person, interesting in Heidelberg, an entrepreneur you probably don't know, but it's a major enterprise in Heidelberg, Ameria. I didn't know, but I was told by very distinguished people that this is the future of Heidelberg. Mr. Meta next to me. So we have a very exclusive, somehow interesting panel over here, and very promising to have some new insights in how we should see the world, how we should see the chances we have, and you are certainly invited to participate in this process. We leave this room enlightened. That's our devotion. So welcome tonight. Welcome to Vinton Cerf, a great man among us. It's a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Jakob. Well, Vinton, I must admit, when I first got the email that said the topic for tonight, I thought, well, it might be a little counterintuitive, because it read, I quote, it's on the digital cooperation agenda, steps we need to take multilaterally and within a multi-stakeholder context to preserve the Internet's integrity and utility and increase safety and security of users and institutions relying on it, right? Yeah, there we go. So, so I thought, well, we're gonna be much smarter after the evening, after we have analyzed all of this stuff, okay? So we're gonna try.
Hoffentlich, yeah.
Vint, if you are not common with what you did, let me introduce you for a second, and you.
Okay.
Okay. You can stop me if you want to.
But they can always just look it up on Wikipedia.
Yeah, that's true. That's what I did, and that's what I say. So he is initially one of the fathers of the internet. He was deeply involved in development of the TCP/IP protocol that the internet relies on, together with Bob Kahn, as I learned. He's an internet pioneer, and now this is from the Wikipedia, a source of reference that became thinkable only through the internet that you have invented. He has received honorary degrees and awards that include the National Medal of Technology, the Turing-Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Marconi Prize, and membership in the National Academy of Engineering. And nowadays, you are a vice president of Google.
Yes. Yeah.
Still. Here we are.
Yeah, sure.
Here we are. So,
unless something happened that they didn't tell me about.
So, the first question, after all the context you gave, is kind of easy and maybe not so easy to answer. How do you assess the state of the internet today?
So, before I answer that, meine Damen und Herren, es freut mich sehr, wieder in Heidelberg zu kommen. Leider muss dieses Gespräch weiter auf Englisch unterhalten. I don't think I said that right. Müssen wir dieses Gespräch auf Englisch unterhalten, weil ich keinen Wortschatz habe. Ich war Student in der Nähe von Stuttgart in 1962, and my vocabulary has evaporated, so the rest of the conversation is self-English. But thank you for inviting us to return. The reason that we're here is that every year, you know, there is a Heidelberg Laureate Forum here in Heidelberg. And I try to come every year, except when there was the pandemic, to meet with computer scientists and with mathematicians, 200 students and the laureates. And we all value the atmosphere of this city. So tonight is just another example of why this is such a great place to come to. So, to come to your question, I think we have discovered that the internet, for all of its power and for all of its value, which it has demonstrated for the past almost 40 years of operation and 50 years since it was designed, it has done very powerful and very useful things. But it has also revealed that this platform, which is relatively neutral, does not know the difference between good quality information, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and all kinds of, and for that matter, malware and denial of service attacks. So we discovered that this powerful platform, especially with the World Wide Web layered on top of the basic internet, is a source of difficulty and even harm. That forces governments of the world, at least in the Western liberal democracies, to be very concerned for the safety and security and privacy of the citizens of each country. And so from the technical point of view, engineers like me and my colleagues at Google and elsewhere are struggling to find a way to tame the internet, to pacify the internet, to make it more secure and more safe and more useful without necessarily destroying all of the value by somehow fragmenting it, by creating barriers across country boundaries, or by filtering so much that the freedom of expression, which is so vital to democratic societies, is suppressed. So how we balance these things is a real challenge. And certainly in the course of tonight's discussion and in the discussions that will come in the future, we struggle to find a balance. This afternoon I was on a video call with the UN Secretary General and his assistants to talk about something called the Internet Governance Forum and the recently formed high-level panel, which will oversee and try to interpret the results of the IGF annual meetings. And in the course of the conversation, it became very clear that we have a lot of work to do to figure out how we can achieve accountability and agency in this online environment. And so to answer your question, the two terms that I now believe are vital to our understanding of this internet phenomenon are accountability and agency. Unless we are able to hold people accountable, or organizations, or even countries accountable for their behavior on the internet, we will not be able to discipline that behavior, which means we have to be able to identify people who are engaging in harmful behaviors. That means absolute anonymity is not your friend in this environment. To give you a small analogy, think about license plates, which are usually just a random mixture of letters and numbers. But there are some people, notably the police, who have the authority to penetrate the veil of anonymity of the license plate to ask who owns this vehicle. And we need the same kind of capability in the internet environment to say who is the party who is performing harmful acts, which, by the way, might cross international boundaries, which makes this a more complicated problem. A victim in cyberspace may be in one jurisdiction, and the party who's acting harmfully may be in another, which leads us to a struggle to figure out how we can get cooperation across national boundaries to hold people accountable for their behavior. The other word which comes to my mind is agency, and it speaks to the question of how we as individuals, how organizations, and how countries have agency to protect themselves and their citizens from harmful behavior, while also identifying and holding accountable those who are behaving in harmful ways. So we are now at a point in the internet's evolution, which is now almost 50 years, of finding norms and possibly even international agreements that will protect the safety and security of individuals, and at the same time maintain the value of this huge, global, gigantic, distributed system, which has produced so much value over the course of the last several decades. And I would emphasize how much value we got in the course of the last 2.5 years during the pandemic in two examples. One, of course, is the ability to use the internet to work from home or to interact with people remotely when we can't be face-to-face. But the second thing was even solving the problem of the pandemic, finding solutions to the vaccine question, which involved sharing of substantial amounts of information. And those are just two recent examples of what the internet has brought us, to say nothing of all the economic gains. We've also learned that when the internet isn't uniformly available to everyone, that there are real disparities and inequalities in its use, its access and use. So we collectively have a great deal of work to do to make this system a lot more uniformly useful for everyone. And I apologize for going on, but since I've got to this point, I'll mention one other thing about equality and equity. The technologies of the internet are not uniformly accessible to people with disability. And it's hard to design and build programs that are easy for someone who is blind or deaf or has a motor impairment or maybe a cognitive impairment to use the system. The programmers who design these systems are not always familiar with what the right things are to do to make a particular program or a particular application easily accessible to someone who has to hear the program because they can't see it, or who has to see captions because they can't hear the instructions. So there's a lot of work to be done to make this capabilities, online services, uniformly available to everyone so they can all benefit. I know that's a really long answer to your question, but I hope you forgive me for trying to touch on points that I hope we can elaborate later in our discussion.
Okay. I would like to jump back for a moment to what you said about identifying people on the internet. Because one of the big concerns is that if you can identify people on the internet and you are, well, you maybe don't live in a democracy as we do and don't have a freedom of speech.
Yes.
And you have government that is looking for patterns in the population to, maybe to go and arrest them. What's your opinion on that when you think of identifying each and every one on the web?
So you've outlined the tension in this whole story. There are certain situations where anonymity is important. The so-called whistleblowing, when something bad is happening and a person wants to report it, there would be bad side effects if they did. Or if they are fighting for democracy in an autocratic country, they are at risk in that battle if they're identified. And I accept that there are conditions under which anonymity is important. I will make the argument that even if you're a whistleblower, the person who is supposed to be hearing the whistleblowing may need to know who is the whistleblower in order to validate the complaint, and then has the obligation to keep that party's identity anonymous. But I would argue strongly that unless we are capable of identifying parties who are behaving badly, we will not be able to remediate the problem. So anonymity, pseudonymity is probably the best we can do.
Okay. When you talk about bad people on the internet and that, there should be a standard globally on, what...
That's hard.
Yeah, of course. What would be the institutions, in your thoughts, that could, preserve the standards that are defined?
Well, this is an interesting problem. It's come to any kind of agreement on a global scale about what the norms should be for behavior in that. There was a group that was organized some years ago. It was the Global Council for something like security on the internet. And they described about a dozen different norms of practice that, for example, they said, we should agree to ban attacks against the core infrastructure of the internet. So we should all agree we aren't going to attack the routers and the underlying transmission systems, the domain name system, maybe the cloud-based host servers. We might agree that we would not attack that infrastructure because of the potential harm that would be caused. And so rather than trying to establish a treaty structure, multilateral treaty structure, they propose simply to adopt a set of norms which are lighter weight, but may be easier to adopt in order to protect that infrastructure. And they had about a dozen other recommendations about practice. So that's a beginning. But if we're serious about dealing with bad behaviors, harmful behaviors, criminal behaviors, then we have to look for broader agreements among countries. We have to have reciprocity. Unless two countries both agree that certain behavior is criminal, it will be very hard for one country to say, you need to go after this other party because they're harming people in my country. So we need to find bilateral, multilateral, treaty-like agreements where we will agree to practices for tracking down people who are executing harmful behaviors. There's another slightly simpler problem that we might consider trying to solve. Imagine for a moment that whatever the harm is exhibited in cyberspace. And so the evidence we have is digital. Now the question is, how do you preserve the digital information so that it can be used as evidence in a court proceeding? We have to agree with each other what the terms and conditions are for preserving the data and maintaining its integrity. Sometimes this is called chain of custody when you're talking about physical objects. They put in plastic bags and somebody signs it, and you keep track of who had access to the evidence. In the digital world, we need moral equivalent of the plastic bag with the signature on it so that we know that the information that's been derived from some bad behavior is credible when it's presented in a legal proceeding. This is something we could agree on because it doesn't even require us to agree on what's criminal and what isn't. It only has to do with agreeing on what is has digital integrity. And so you can imagine sort of slicing the salami, one little bit at a time to come to these international agreements until we get to the point where we can collectively do a better job of disciplining bad behavior on the network.
When I read about what you speak about very often, there was one thought that was a bit irritating to me. When you
Oh, good. That will mean there's controversy. Just watch this.
No, you said, maybe I misunderstood it, I don't know, that in this age of knowledge where we collect so much data each day and we have all the knowledge of the world in digital form somehow, you said, well, we could lose all that data.
Oh, yes.
How's that?
Okay, so this is easy. Everybody here probably has a mobile phone. Everybody here probably has a mobile phone with a camera. And everyone here probably uses the camera. I know we used ours tonight several times to take pictures of some very important wine labels from our friend over here. The question, though, is how long does digital information last? How long does it survive? And I'm sure you can appreciate that every digital image or any digital object, a spreadsheet, a computer game, a text document, has some software that's needed to correctly render it, to present it, or to let you interact with it. So now I want you to imagine it's 500 years from now, and someone has found some digital content on something that's still readable. That would be pretty amazing all by itself. But now the problem is they don't know how to interpret what the bits mean, because even if we preserve the bits, the operating system that ran the software that knows what the bits mean may not be operational 500 years from now, or maybe even 10 years from now. And so much of my worry has been on digital preservation of digital content. Beyond simply preserving the bits, we have to preserve the ability to interpret them. And that's going to take a very deliberate effort to make sure we have captured, for example, the instruction set of a piece of hardware. So if, in the worst case, we can emulate the hardware, so we can run the old operating system, so we can run the old application, so we can interpret the old files. I have a worked example. Some of you may remember that there were 5¼ floppy disks. Does that ring a bell for some of you? And then later there were 3½ floppy disks. I found a stack of 3½ floppy disks in my basement one day, and I wondered, what's on them? And I didn't have a 3½ floppy disk reader anymore. So I went on eBay, and I bought a 3½ floppy disk reader that plugged into my Macintosh. And I stuck the 3½ floppy disk in the reader, and lo and behold, a bunch of files showed up. Most of them were WordPerfect files, and I didn't have a functioning instance of the WordPerfect word processing program available. So now I'm stuck with a bunch of uninterpretable bits. But by good fortune, I have an ancient Macintosh, big 17-inch Macintosh, that still has the WordPerfect software on it. So I managed to get that running on that old laptop, and then I translate it into Microsoft Word, and then I can move the file over to a more recent processor. So I recovered all the WordPerfect files, and they're editable in Microsoft Word. But that was preservation by accident. That's not a plan. So we need to think our way through this to make sure that the archaeologists of the future, to say nothing of our descendants, have access to our digital information if they're interested.
Well, let's see. We all hope that companies like Google would preserve the data on the cloud and update them with each new version of cloud they provide. I hope this is on the roadmap also.
So, well, this depends on whether we last for hundreds of years. You can just imagine that, I'm concerned about this digital preservation. Can you imagine my walking into Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, saying, hi, Sundar, I'd like to talk to you about when Google goes out of business. This is not a good way to begin a conversation with a CEO. And so I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I introduce this worry that we need to take steps to assure that people can get their information back out and put it somewhere, maybe in a file, a hard disk or something that you can point to and say, it's there, that's all my data. So we do have service that's called Takeout. which allows people to pull data out of the Google Cloud. But I still worry about the other issues associated with running old operating systems and old applications to interpret old file formats. And we try very hard to map our, for example, Google Docs into a variety of other formats like Microsoft Word or PDFs or other things like that.
Mm-hmm. What value do you place on new technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence as maybe a new generation on the internet?
So do you all have this feeling of hyperbole about machine learning and artificial intelligence? I mean, it's sort of, ooh, this is really dangerous stuff. And we have very big concerns about ethics, about how these technologies are being used. Honestly, they're pretty amazing. There's one of our sister companies in the alphabet group. Google is the biggest, but there are others. One's called DeepMind, and I'm sure many of you have heard about them. They're the ones that wrote a program called AlphaGo, which figured out how to play the Go game, which is the 19 by 19-inch board, which is a lot bigger than the 8 by 8 chessboard. The number of states that game can get into is much larger than the number of states you can get into in chess, which is already pretty big. That AlphaGo program learned how to beat international grandmasters in Go. And since that time, there have been other developments like AlphaZero, which have learned how to play chess over the course of a few hours and can beat any known chess playing program. Maybe not beating grandmasters, but in a few hours it could be trained to play really good chess. So, and then you get other kinds of applications, whether it's image recognition, diagnosis of images of cells that might be cancerous, translation of languages from one to another, transcription of speech from sound to text, and vice versa, the production of speech. These are all products of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's an incredibly powerful technology. And it's funny, if we go back into history for just a moment, around 1960, there were two researchers who got the idea that they could build a kind of neural network that would be a little bit like the way human brains work. But it was exactly one layer deep. And two guys, Minsky and Papert and MIT, said it doesn't do very much. And they wrote a book called Perceptrons, published, I think, in 1964, but don't hold me to that. And they said, basically, this doesn't work very well. And so there's this sort of nuclear winter in artificial intelligence for about a decade. But there were several people who were very determined to continue to explore the neural network concepts. But they pushed further into architecture where there were hundreds of layers of these neural networks as opposed to only one. And they were very successful in getting the hardware and the software to work extremely well. So now we're seeing all kinds of applications of machine learning to hard problems that are more solvable because of the scale at which these systems can work. So I'm actually very excited about this, but at the same time, I'm worried for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is that these systems, as powerful as they are and as impressive as they are also brittle. Sometimes they don't work the way we would like them to. There are some very simple examples of this. If you imagine training a neural network to recognize images, and you might train it with cats and dogs and kangaroos and crocodiles and steam engines and fire trucks. And so you've trained it against all these images, and you show it these new images that it hasn't seen before, and it says it's a cat, or it's a fire truck, or it's a bear, or it's a tennis racket. And then you build something that we now call generative adversarial networks, GANs. So what are they about? So you can imagine one neural network is designed to recognize stuff. And the generative adversarial network is designed to modify the pixels of the images to fool the recognizer. And it turns out you can do that. And so one of the more dramatic examples of this is you've trained your machine learning system to recognize cats, because there are a lot of those on the internet. And the generative adversarial network goes in and changes 3 pixels of a cat image. And the recognition system announces when it sees this image, it's a fire truck. Now, if you and I look at that slightly modified image, we say, no, it isn't, it's a cat. Because we have ways of recognizing the features of a cat, you know, pointy little ears and furry long tails. But that's not how computer vision necessarily works. So now we have to learn that these machine learning systems have their weaknesses. And we have to be very careful not to rely on them exclusively to make decisions or even to make recommendations without taking into account what human beings are capable of understanding about the context in which the decisions might be made or the recommendations might be made. So we hear a lot of worry about ethics and machine learning. We've invested heavily at Google in committees that review the applications of machine learning, make sure that we're not doing something inappropriate. But I have to say that while the fire bell is ringing on machine learning, I'm over here in the other side of the room saying, excuse me, have you noticed how dependent we are on programs that have nothing to do with machine learning? They're just all the apps that are running in your mobile. Right. And I get a little nervous that we aren't paying enough attention to just plain old ordinary software in addition to software that's part of the machine learning and artificial intelligence world. Both of them need our attention because they can both have bugs and they can both make recommendations or decisions that are not necessarily correct. And so I want to broaden the concern for software to go beyond just machine learning.
Let's bring in Untitled Chapter at this point. Maybe he's been running a software company for about 20 years, right? How important is artificial intelligence, machine learning for really running a software company nowadays? Even here in Heidelberg, if you're not Google.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's an easy one. I think the point is, running a software company means, first of all, that you solve any kind of business problem. For that, you need a software. And that you don't do in the very beginning, even not on a later stage, by machine learning or artificial intelligence. You do it by solving the problem in terms of writing a code that solves the business process problem. And that's what Google did in the beginning. They invented an incredible good software that was the best in terms of getting search results of what you're searching for. And that was the best software. And in this case, the best technology became the monopolist, particularly in the Western world, the monopolist for this.
We don't like to use that
I
word.
I know. Yes, yes. But
we just did a good product.
You just did a great product. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me here. But anyway, you're the world market leader in that, and that you did not on the basis of machine learning, but you did it on doing this good software development and then coming in with in a later stage. Now, of course, using that data that you have in order to advance technical level on technology, and also, of course, and that's another side of the story, and I just come to what we do at Ameria. Of course, this whole machine learning stuff needs a tremendous input, and we all know that this input is not only done by like some usual workers in the Western world, but also by hundreds of thousands of Indian employees, for example, that take pictures, mark certain features or in an image, and that first of all have to give the machine a basis of understanding what it actually is looking for. And when this is a huge workforce, so there are estimations out there that a couple of million people in India working on this, not only for Google, but for all the big tech giants,
right.
and that is one thing we all should know about machine learning. And these are not the most well-paid jobs. Yeah? That is another side of the story. So obviously, the artificial intelligence is not as intelligent as we always assume when we say this word artificial intelligence. So what we did at Ameria, we developed a gesture control software, which is a new human-machine interface where you can just control screens of any kind by not touching it, but by steering it in the air with 2D gestures and 3D gestures. And there comes a lot of applications out of it. It's obvious that you can do lots of stuff with it. For example, just controlling the screen in your car without touching it, but just having your arm easily on the middle console, yeah, and just controlling the screen from there, for example. Or you can use it at the point of sale in order to sell more, to make marketing, to have gamification, infotainment, lots of stuff like that. So we were always driven in that case, we were always driven by the business problem. What do we want? We want to sell more. We want to make processes more efficient. We want to collect data. Very difficult to say this openly in Germany all the time, as we had this already. But in the end, companies like our customers, they need personalized data with the consent, GDPR-conform consent of the customer in order to make targeted marketing. Otherwise, spend millions in vain. So that's what a good business is about. So that's all what we do. And at a certain point in time, we understood, okay, what can we do here in order to make our human-machine interface, this moving the finger, more efficient? And then we found out, okay, there are patterns, yeah, what people do wrong. But where did we find, how did we find out what people do in terms of wrong, yeah, when they're in front of a screen? And that was not artificial intelligence, but that were our people standing in front of that and watching other people using it not in the way we want them to use it, yeah? But of course, we can't go out there and tell each and everyone, you don't have to use it like that, use it like that, yeah? People obviously make a move like that, yeah? And they mean the point, they want to touch this point, but other means when they do this, they want to point to this point. So what do they mean? Yeah? And we found out, okay, in a couple of milliseconds, we can identify what user is intending to do. Wow. Yeah? But the initial idea about how to use now machine learning and collecting the data in a 3D room with pixels and voxels and understanding the vectors, that was in the beginning a pattern that we realized. And then we gave it to the machine to say it in simple words.
Okay, I see. Our time's almost up, not yet. Before I want to open the floor, and you can think of your questions now, I want to ask Vint a very easy question.
Okay, that's always nice.
It's my last one. What's your favorite application or your favorite website on the internet?
Wow, I have to confess to you, this sounds very self-serving, but I'm out there doing Google all the time. And the reason is that sometimes I don't remember facts and I need to find them. And Google is my friend when it comes to that. Although I will say, in the context of our earlier conversation, that there's a certain amount of critical thinking that's useful because what you discover on the net, even with our good quality Google search, might not be right. And so being able to ask yourself, where did this information come from? Is there any correlating evidence for claims that are being made? Is somebody trying to get me to believe something that I shouldn't believe? You should be asking those questions. We should be teaching our kids to use their wetware to think critically about what they're seeing and hearing, not just on the internet, but in television, radio, newspapers, magazines, books, and your friends and your parents. Of course, some parents don't like it when their kids say, I question that. You know, no, you can't. Anyway, my view right now is that we really need we almost need to have an internet driver's license. I mean, this sounds a little crazy, but think about it. Before we give teenagers the keys to the car, we tell them, okay, you need to take a class, you need to learn how to drive a car safely, you need to assume that every other driver on the road is crazy, verrückt, and so you need to drive defensively. And then when they satisfy us that they've learned the rules, then we let them have a license to drive the car. And in a very funny way, we need an internet driver's license for the same reason. Now, I'm not serious about forcing people to take an exam and get a real driver's license or internet driver's license, but I think we should be teaching people how to think about the online environment and to recognize that everything you encounter may not be correct or accurate or true, and that there are some people who are out there who are determined to mislead you. And that's just, unfortunately, a fact of life of this general infrastructure on top of which we have put all these different applications. So I would like very much to advocate for at least the moral equivalent of the internet driver's license to equip people to use the system online in a safe and secure way.
That's a good word for the end for now, because this is actually something we discuss a lot, right, Jacob? That's one of the,
Right.
core discussion topics
Right.
in schools nowadays, how to advocate students to use the internet reasonably, right?
So just think for a moment, if you forgive me for just interrupting here, but think for a second about your growing up. Now, you're going to encounter information from a variety of different sources, not just the internet. I know a lot of kids, first they go to TikTok, and they get all kinds of varied information. Some of it's not so good. The thing is that they may get information from other sources than just online sources too. Like I say, radio, magazine, books, and things like that. And so we want to make sure that they are equally critical of all the sources of information that they encounter, and have the capacity to evaluate and analyze what sources they are getting and trusting. And that's, I think, a skill that we want everyone to have. I'm sorry for the interrupt, but it just...
Not a problem. Okay. Does any one of you have a question for Vint?
Well, or first of all, they may have questions that I don't have any answers to.
Well,
it's okay to have an opinion, too, I think, to make this into a real conversation.
here's your microphone.
Yes, over there.
I'm waiting for question number 101. That question is about the history of the internet. What were you thinking? Maybe this isn't question 101. Yes, sir.
I think it's such a question. Thank you very much for the nice talks and all. And I want to refer to the beginning of the issue of identifying people in the internet. There's a lot of hate speech in the internet, and there are also people who do this hate speech with their clear name. It happens that they say cruel things like, you need to die or something.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
sure. Yes.
with their clear name. This happens, so they won't do it in this room, I'm sure, but they do it on Twitter also.
Yes.
Do you have an idea how this can be and how to fix this, maybe?
Well, let me first ask, this is you should watch what I'm about to do. This is classic, right? The professor has just asked the graduate student a hard question, and so the graduate student tries to figure out how to contort the question around so he can answer it. So the first observation, I may ask, do you ever read any of Shakespeare's plays? Yes? Shakespeare? Do you? Yes, okay. So the reason that you read Shakespeare's plays 400 years later is that the plays are still relevant because they speak to human motivation, good and bad. So we're still living in a world where people have these various motivations. You clearly point them out here. So the question is what to do about that. And I don't believe that it's possible to design and build an algorithm that somehow filters out all the bad stuff. We can do some things like that. And at Google and other places, we do try to build software that recognizes sentiment and recognizes the harmful expressions and tries to filter that out, or harmful images and things like that. But I think we also need to build into the users of these online systems the ability to recognize harmful behavior and to reject it. So we're back to the wetware argument again. I do agree, though, that sometimes to achieve the objective, which is a safer and more secure and less harmful environment, that sometimes we need to find a way to create incentive for companies like mine and others to do what they can to minimize some of that bad behavior. I'll make an analogy. It's an American analogy, but it might also hold here in Germany. I just don't know for sure, but we'll test that theory. In the United States, for many years, you could build cars that didn't have any seat belts. And one day, and we would show student drivers, here's what happens when you're driving a car and you don't have a seat belt and you have a crash. And we would show them some pretty terrible pictures. Then finally somebody got the wise idea that the government should say to the automobile makers, we're not going to let you sell any cars in this country that don't have seat belts. So you have to have a seat belt. And then they turned around and they said to the drivers, if we catch you driving and you're not wearing a seat belt, there will be consequences. And so the point I want to make is that we may have to invoke similar kinds of practices to say, we're back to accountability again, that there are certain behaviors that our society says are unacceptable, and if we catch you doing those behaviors, there will be consequences. So I will give you my three remedies for the problem you described. Remedy number one, if you can actually use a piece of technology to prevent somebody from doing something harmful, that's a good thing. But that doesn't always work. So the next thing we can say is, if we catch you doing these things, then there will be consequences, sort of like speeding or doing other bad things in the car. And then there's the third thing we can do. We can say, don't do that, it's wrong. Now, that sounds weak, but I have to remind you, especially a group like you, that the weakest force in the universe is gravity. But when you have enough of it, you can keep the planets in orbit, and it keeps us from flying off of the planet. And so just like in the social environment, if we have enough agreement in our society that certain behaviors are unacceptable, then we set a kind of gravitational norm for behaviors that we accept and behaviors that we reject. And so peer pressure becomes the moral equivalent of gravity. And honestly, I think those are the only three tools that we have: technical inhibition, post hoc enforcement, and moral suasion.
More questions?
Surely somebody wants to disagree with something. There's also another one way in the back there. Wave your hand. Where were you? Were you there? Yes, that one. So that's, keep your number. That's number 2. Okay, go ahead.
All right, so thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts. And I found it really intriguing, the thought about that police of internet, the internet police. I find it just as exciting as I find it scary, because with how was it? With great power comes great responsibility, and there will be people behind these systems managing and surveilling things. And how do you think we could have people not abuse this power? Because if we say live in a world where we have anonymity or pseudonymity in the internet, which we don't, I think at least, this power would be really great and scary. And yeah, the question is, how would you propose we stop people from abusing that?
Okay, I want to make sure that I actually understood the question. Part of the problem is there's this big damn light and you're hiding in the dark. This is the surveillance question about how do we protect people's privacy?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So we actually agree with you, just putting my Google hat on, that we're trying to find a way to do our business, which is trying to steer advertising to people. That we're very open that that's our business, or a major part of our business, but at the same time, we want people to feel like their privacy has not been invaded. So we're trying very hard to find ways of getting very aggregate kinds of categorization rather than something very precise and specific about it. I know people get very upset when they go and they buy something on Amazon and then ads start popping up for the same thing that you just bought. There's something very eerie about that. And so we're working hard to try to move away from things like that. There's strong motivation that's been given to us here in Europe, especially between GDPR and the new DSA, the Digital Services Act, and the DMA is it Digital Marketing Act, or Digital Markets Act. So there are a whole bunch of things that are happening in the legislative space that provides incentive to find different ways of achieving objectives that don't have the same potential hazards. So I think we would agree that we would like to find a way to perform the function which we currently perform, which is providing people services for free and paying for that using advertising revenue in a way that doesn't expose people's privacy any more than is absolutely necessary, and we want to do that by more aggregation. So I think we would agree. Now, I do have to tell you something, though, as an engineer. There's a concept that was evolved here in Europe that was called the right to be forgotten. Yeah. And I think we can all resonate with the possibility that there's something out there which happened a long time ago and it's not relevant anymore. Although there are other cases where if it's a politician, you might want the general public to know about something that the politician did a long time ago because it might affect your, political view of that particular candidate. But we'll set that aside for a moment. This right to be forgotten is an understandable objective, but I want you to think for a minute about what it means for us to implement. Guess what we have to do? We have to remember everything that we're supposed to forget. Because if we're supposed to forget it, we have to remember to remove it from the index that we keep regenerating on an hourly basis. And so the idea that you have to remember everything that you're supposed to forget means that over time you have to keep remembering more and more stuff that you're supposed to forget. From the technical point of view, this is not too reassuring. The ideal outcome of this would be that if the source of the material that shows up in our index were removed as part of the right to be forgotten process, if it goes away from the web server because the host of the information has been told you have to remove that, that makes it more implementable. At the moment, the easy target is the indexer, but the indexer doesn't have any ability to make the stuff go away on the hosts and websites that it's indexing. So we could use some help to figure out a more efficient way to get rid of the stuff that we all agree should go away. So right now it's a little weird from the engineering point of view, but I think I understand the motivation behind it.
So May I answer? I'm sorry, the question was confusing. So the thing about anonymity on the internet was a comment of mine, and the question was about if we have a surveilling institution. You said a kind of internet police, so that we can recognize people who are doing harm. But the question was, how do we keep the people that are surveilling from doing harm, the data they have in hand? That was the question.
So this is how do we balance the identifying of people for holding them accountable and at the same time protecting their privacy?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Did I say that right? You were nodding, but
I think you did. Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just you're asking how to. He just said how do you balance it? Yeah. So surveillance against.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
What you
Right.
call the accountability. So surveillance and accountability. This is that is and how to identify someone.
So this gets back to the license plates for just a moment as an analogy, as a metaphor. In the license plate case, you and I see license plates as just random characters, letters and numbers. There are some people who have the authority to pierce the veil of the random license plate to say who owns the car. That may not tell you who the driver is, by the way, but at least it tells you who owns the car. So the idea here is this differential ability to penetrate the veil of pseudonymity. And this gets back to this core question of how do we hold people or organizations or even countries accountable for their behavior? We have to have ways of identifying them. That doesn't mean that you have to reveal who you are just to use the internet. I think that would be a terrible outcome. So I don't think you should have to, identify yourself just because you're doing a search on the Google engine. But there does need to be a way to find out who you are. If, for example, you're pumping out malware, or you're sending out phishing emails, or you're doing some other kind of harmful thing. And the part that makes this so hard is that sometimes the bad behavior comes out of one jurisdiction and is harming someone in another jurisdiction. And so my work with the United Nations has been all around figuring out how do we get cooperation. And for our next trick, ladies and gentlemen, how do we get cooperation across international boundaries in order to hold people accountable for their behavior? And so this is quite a balancing act. But we need to find common norms that we can agree to, and the kind of peer pressure that social agreement can generate to get people to either moderate their behavior, or in the absence of that, to hold them accountable by more powerful means, by saying some things are unacceptable and there will be consequences if we find you doing that. But that does mean that you can't be absolutely anonymous in this environment. I think we have to accept the idea that holding people accountable means we have to be able to identify them or organizations or, frankly, countries.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a gentleman in the back.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm very thankful to talk to you today. My question does not relate to the privacy question. It's related to the AI and the loss of data and useful systems to the progress of technology. You said with the floppy disks. AI or machine learning works in a riddled system to optimize what it does best, and becomes the best, as you said, with the chess master. But today, if we advance our technology, the chess field changes. So will a machine learning algorithm or AI become useless because we use newer systems like 3D photos or holograms instead of pictures?
So will the system, the machine learning algorithm, become as well useless because we use newer advanced technology, and will it get lost or doesn't function anymore? You said if you have a normal kitten picture and it becomes changed and a bit corrupted maybe, it stops, the algorithm stops working and we don't know why it stopped working. And if we change the system in which the algorithm works by advancing our technology, will it stop working? Because it's the system in which it is operating as good as it can is not anymore.
So, first of all, you should be levitating out of your seat right now, and so we're going to let you answer this too, but I would like to make a comment about it. First of all, I often think about artificial intelligence and machine learning in the following terms. If it works, it's engineering. If it only works some of the time, it's artificial intelligence. So we have these sort of imperfect but quite powerful tools that AI and machine learning have given us. I think what we are having to learn as time goes on how to apply these methods, knowing that they are going to be brittle in some cases. They're going to be narrow, they're very powerful, they are enabling, and yet they can occasionally fail. And we want to be conscious of the fact that they could fail, so we don't rely on them inappropriately and more than we should. So we need backup and the ability to detect that we have relied on something that's inappropriate. But I want to turn to you because so much of your work dives into exactly this really interesting probabilistic space. So how do you deal with the possibility that the algorithms that you would like to rely on don't always work?
Thank you for handing this over. I have one very good example for your question. Actually, we developed our machine learning algorithms for quite a big screen, 55-inch screen. And that was the beginning where we have been like 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. Then in last year, we started to develop that in-car control system, which I just explained before. And we realized at a certain point in time that what we have learned with this larger screen can help us right now. And that was let me say that an open word, brain fuck somehow, because we did not realize in the beginning what we actually had, what kind of data. So you are asking about 2D data, 3D data, like changing from old Web 2.0 to metaverse, 3D worlds and so on. You never know what happens when you collect data in the very beginning. You just don't know it. And the amount of computing space that we have with cloud services, the amount of data that we can collect today, you don't know what kind of problem you can solve with that tomorrow. And that is part of this, what you call an artificial intelligence, and that's probably on a more philosophical scale what is so amazing about it, because at this moment, openly, lots of those things, what we just say it's artificial intelligence, it's most of it is machine learning, But it will turn sooner or later on the basis of data that we can collect within a couple of weeks, like when we're born and we are a very small child. Our brain collects so much data.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think it's within 1 week or 2 weeks we collect more data with our brain than all computers combined can, with all sensors, collect over the whole world. It's amazing what we can collect. We know we have the eyes, we have the ears. Yes. The child has already some information from the womb when it was in the mother. So there is lots of data that is combined. And this is the basis. So, of course, it's scary. Yes, it's scary. And it was scary for us as well when we understood that was a totally different purpose for which we collected the data. And what we do today, We just try to be a little bit like Google. We try to collect whatever we get, because you never know what is good for on the next stage of development when you come to other stuff.
So I do have an example of something that's really amazing about humans. I want you to think for just a moment about what a table is. Here's an example over here. It's basically a flat surface that's perpendicular to the gravitational field. Now, most people probably don't use those words when they think it's a table. And certainly a 2-year-old doesn't think about that. The 2-year-old discovers very quickly what a table is. They notice that if it has a flat bottom, the table holds it up, from the floor. And they know if it's round or it's not flat, it may roll off the table. And they learn this very quickly with small number of examples. And then after they have those little examples, they also figure out, a box could be a table, or a chair could be a table. Your lap could be a table. And so these kids at this young age generalize in ways most of our artificial intelligence systems don't know how to do yet. And so I'm more worried about relying too heavily on the brittle machine learning systems of today than I am about the possibility that they will overtake human beings in any time soon, because our brains are really amazing.
Jakob, at this point of time, what's going on your mind after this discussion?
We're very specific. At the moment, we experience something mind-boggling in the 21st century. That's Putin's attack on Ukraine.
Yes.
And if the motivation is, as in many people's minds, of generals and leaders, somehow to get into the history book.
Oh.
And at the same time, you notice this kind of amnesia that people, today there was a large article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine that we missed celebrating the 2500th day of celebration of the famous Battle of Salamis, which obviously is at the turning point of defining European history, cultural history. Now, I have made this test in Heidelberg about a mayor who was Lord Mayor in Heidelberg for 21 years.
Okay.
And I had a group of 40 years old, and I asked them, "Do you still remember Mr. Sundel?" He said, "Who is that?" So he totally disappeared. He, in a way, covered the front page of the local newspapers for 20 years. Totally disappeared.
And then poof. Well, that sounds very American. We don't remember anything that happened 2 weeks ago.
So how, if the motivation of our leaders is to get into history books, what a stupid attitude
Yes.
towards a kind of sort of, do they, that's my question, do they somehow trust new technologies that might sort of, the floppy disk you're talking about, that there might be a floppy disk that keeps them in mind, in our mind?
Oh my, you mean you want to have a digital Denkmal?
Right.
Right.
Monuments.
I cannot imagine a worse motivation than wanting to do some horribly bad thing so that you are remembered in history for having done some horribly bad thing.
Right.
And to be quite blunt, there are people who are driven by that. I mean, in the United States, we have people who use, military weapons and kill people simply because they want to be known as the person who killed more people than anybody else. I don't know whether our society has has started to reward people for visibility in a way that is harmful to the society. I mean, this famous for being famous is a terrible metric. And it's entirely possible with some of the technologies that we are currently using exacerbate that problem. I mean, think about people who do bad things and they stream video on Twitter or something like that. And they do that for visibility. They do that because it makes them known to others. And I think that a lot of the online environments are rewarding these kinds of behaviors because they reward the visibility. Right. And it really feels to me like we should, I mean, collectively, we should have brought sociologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and anthropologists to the table to ask them if they could anticipate how our applications would affect our society. And I still think that we should be hiring anthropologists and sociologists and so on to help us understand that better than we seem to today.
You were talking about, in a way, the majority, how to use the internet. I would raise the question, how do you see enlightenment in the 21st century?
Enlightenment, oh my, what an 18th century notion that is.
Right.
Well, actually, I'm kind of excited about that idea. I have a big, the age of enlightenment in the 18th century was a really amazing period of time when reason became an important part of the environment, when scientific measurement and understanding the way the universe worked was more and more feasible because we could invent ways of measuring how the world worked, and then we build models that would let us reason about that. And so I see the computing tools of today as enablers of that enlightenment. For a lot of us, even though people are saying artificial intelligence is scary, I see this as an incredibly powerful augmenting capability that helps us think and see the world in ways that we could not do on our own. And so you hear these terms, computational biology, computational linguistics, computational physics, computational astrophysics, and what it's saying to you basically is, with a computer and the right software and applications, the combination can understand our world better than we could do on our own. And I'm persuaded, you hear these terms, big data and so on, there's truth to this. This is our ability to ingest huge amounts of data and to make sense out of it is a really powerful tool. And so even though I worry about abuses in the online world and abuses of computing and everything else, I'm just as excited about the enlightenment that's possible with this partnership between human beings and things that can compute in ways that we can't.
I would have one more question for you.
Sure.
While we're talking about history, there have been several leap innovation steps in communications over the past century. I've learned that you're a fan of Downton Abbey, right?
I'm not a fan. My wife has Downton Abbey disease, for those of you who wonder about that. It's a terrible, really severe case. I mean.
And just at the time Downton Abbey plays, a couple of very new technologies have been invented.
Yes, that's right.
Many historians say that they have at least a part as a root cause for the First World War and for the clash of mass weapons, mass media, and so on. How do you think, is there any lesson in history how we can tame the negative side effects that internet as an overall invention that was good, that was needed, that was just being necessarily invented. Probably you have been the guy in helping inventing it, yeah. But it was on the process of it could not be forbid to invent it. And same is true about television. Same is true about radio. Same is true about newspapers. Same is true about lots of other inventions. Is there any lesson in history from your perspective that could help tame the thing?
Well, I think there are lessons that we can take away. Whether they teach us enough or whether we're willing to accept the lessons they're trying to teach is a different question. But it's very clear that that's my mobile telling me another email has just shown up. Too many of them keep showing up, but that's another story. I think that if we've learned anything at all, it is that these technologies that are essentially neutral can be used to amplify both good things and bad things. And, you know, just like radio can be used to propagate the truth, it can be used, or television can be used to propagate what's going on right now. I mean, there's nothing more compelling than, you know, a video camera showing you a tsunami taking place in real time. So these technologies are very, very powerful, but they also don't know the difference between truth and falsehood. And in fact, it's getting worse in some ways because the digital technologies are letting us create artificial reality, if you like. And it's kind of disturbing to think that the entertainment world loves these technologies because they can resurrect old actors and actresses and inject them into their, you know, movies. And this is great. And we're all entertained by that. It's wonderful. And that's exact same technology can mislead us by having a world leader appear to say or do something that they didn't do, but we can't tell that they didn't do it because it looks like it's real. So in a sense, all of these worries that arise from the technologies of today often have the solutions in the technologies that are creating the problem. And so a small example of this is that if privacy is an issue, cryptography is your friend. Of course, cryptography can also be used to hide bad behaviors that somebody doesn't want you to know about. And so we're confronted repeatedly by technologies that have this dual character to them. And we can't rely on the technology to tell us what to do. It has to be the societal norms that we adopt as a society that determines what's acceptable and what isn't. And so the big challenge for every one of us is not the technical side. It's figuring out what norms we should be advocating and how we should be enforced and how we should be held accountable to them. That's the challenge.
Jimmy, come.
Yeah, you just mentioned again what I was thinking about ever since you mentioned it early on about policing the internet or finding a system to kind of separate right from wrong. And you are also saying that you are talking to the UN to see how to, I assume, to implement anything in that regard. And I just assume that's much more complicated than inventing the internet in the first place. Because I'm curious if there's actually, if this is just what you think should be happening in a perfect world, or if there are actually people out there working on possible scenarios, how to come up with a system to do this. As you said, the different jurisdictions, there are different countries. Even in the US, we can't even agree on how to regulate guns, no less the internet. So is actually anything going on in that direction? Are there people trying to solve this problem? Or is this just that you think in a perfect world we would be able to police the internet, to go after people who do wrong or try to harm people intentionally? Is there actually anything happening already? Or is this just a kind of a thought that it would be nice if we were able to do this? Thank you.
Well, if I've understood the question correctly, I would interpret this as, can we write a program that knows what's right and what's wrong, and can we make a distinction between them? So the answer is yes in the following very limited sense. If any of you follow tax laws, and our tax laws change every year in the United States. It's really a hard problem to keep track of it. That's why we have to hire people to help us do our taxes. You can write an algorithm that can say, yes, this follows the rules, or no, it doesn't. That's the easy case. It's a complicated case, but it's an easy case. The hard case, I think, comes when we're asking about a more philosophical question of right and wrong. And I don't know whether this is a phrase that you would find here in German. There is in English, there's this notion of the still voice that tells you when you're doing something wrong. We haven't figured out how to introduce that still voice into a computer program, except in the cases where it's very explicit how to define what's acceptable and what isn't. So that's why we have so much focus of attention right now on ethics and artificial intelligence, out of a concern that the machine learning programs will be used to make decisions that are somehow not ethical because they are not fair, or they're biased in some way, or maybe they're just dead wrong. I think that's why we want people to stay in a loop of a lot of decision-making processes. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm actually more worried about software in general that I'm relying on every day than I am about artificial intelligence. So have you ever gotten into an elevator where you go to the control and it says select the floor that you want? And so you put floor number in and the door opens up. And you go into the elevator and there are no controls anymore. It's somebody else's software that you're relying on to get you to where the floor is that you're supposed to go. And I know enough about software to be worried that they didn't get it right, and that somehow I'll end up between floor number 9 and floor number 10 because the programmer messed up somehow. And so I get more nervous about ordinary software, and it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence, than I am about the AI.
Okay. Any more questions around? Yeah, bitte.
My second question. I would be interested in the first days of the internet. I suppose you already thought about freedom of the internet and limitless internet being without frontiers. How do you feel about developments today, like in China, where they're building a great firewall that keeps out Facebook and Western platforms, and they have their own platforms, and they are censoring a lot? How do you feel about that sort of fragmentation that is actually taking place?
So you had to ask that, didn't you? Let me give you an analogy by way of answer. The way I look at the internet, when Bob Kahn and I were doing the original design, it's sort of like we were designing a highway system. And we said to everybody, okay, we're designing this highway system, and it's intended to connect one place to another. And you can build vehicles, and we don't care if it's a bicycle or a motorcycle or, a VW Bug or something else, as long as it's not wider than this and longer than that and taller than this or heavier than that, it should work. And oh, by the way, please drive on only one side of the road so that the other cars can go the other way. So we designed a set of rules that allowed vehicles to move on this figurative road system. We didn't say anything about the buildings that are adjacent to the roads, and we didn't say anything about what the cars and the trucks and the lorries are carrying. We just basically tried to lay out what this communication system would look like. So it's a very simple design to first order. Of course, then people decided to actually use it and apply it. And I refuse to take responsibility for what people decided to do with the internet. If you're smart, you know, if you have kids and they do well, you're smart not to take too much credit, because if they mess up, you don't have to take too much blame. And so I'm very careful about how much credit I want for the internet. It's the applications that it supports that are largely at issue. And our concerns about this reflect our society and what our society values. So my enthusiasm for the internet is undimmed. I'm still very excited about what it can do, what it can enable. But I'm also very concerned that our society understands that it also has a potential for harm, and that we need to figure out how to contain that potential, while at the same time keeping as open an environment as possible for all the benefits that we already know that it's delivered. Of course, when some people say, well, did you know all the things that were going to happen? And it's very tempting to say, yep, we have it all figured out. In fact, let's see, in about half an hour, I'll tell you about the next thing that's going to happen, but I would be lying. The fact is, I don't know what the next thing is that's going to happen. It lies in the minds of people like you, who are inventing, and you too, who are inventing new ways to take advantage of this technology. So it's our responsibility collectively to figure out how to make this a safer and more secure environment, and to insist on that.
Maybe this is a very stupid question, but who's taking care of the internet? I mean, if there's like something going on and you have to reboot it or something, is there anybody, is there any group or any entity that's taking care of that?
That's actually just what's a wonderful question. Thank you. I did not put her up to asking that question. Believe me, the internet does not run all on its own. There are literally millions of people whose job it is to keep it running properly. I'm not sure this will work because it might be a bilingual joke, but many years ago, when I was the senior vice president of engineering at a company called MCI, we ran 2 big internet backbones. And I went to the operations center where we had staff who were concentrating on how is it working, and if something is broken, we need to reboot it or fix the software. And there was a sign on one of the booths and it said, Vinton Cerf may be one of the fathers of the internet, but we're the mothers who have to make it work. So we honestly, the benefit that you're getting, to the extent that you're getting benefit from the internet, is because a lot of people are very dedicated to keeping it running. Now, it's interesting that you raised this question of reboot, because recently the question came up among the technical community. What would happen if the entire internet stopped working and we had to reboot it from zero? Do we know whether we could do that? And you know what? We're not sure we have an answer to that question. And a bunch of us are getting together now saying, if this whole thing just stopped and we had to reboot it all, do we know whether we could make it work? What conditions, and specifically what information, would have to be in place and where, so that the system could literally come back into operation again? And so your question is very relevant. We're hoping that this doesn't happen, but if it did, we'd like to have an answer which we would like to be, yes, we know how to reboot the internet. But at this moment, I cannot tell you that I know how to do that. So at the moment, the internet has never collapsed in total. Pieces of it have collapsed over time because of denial of service attacks or bugs in the software. In fact, most of the bad things that you hear about the internet are the result of some programmer who made a mistake or somebody who configured things incorrectly. which means that some of the most harmful things that occur have nothing to do with evil attacks against anything. It's because some programmer made a mistake. So we have a lot of work to do to build the system, build into the system more resilience and reliability. But maybe by the time next year rolls around, I'll have an answer to the question, if you had to, could you reboot the internet?
Maybe now at the end, the dumbest report question. How did it feel sending the first email on the public internet? You rose the question yourself.
Well, you know, the real answer to this is that I feel like I was privileged to be a part of this story. But the thing that I'm most aware of is that you can't do anything big unless you get help. And so rule number one, if you want to do something big, get help, especially from people who are smarter than you are. And I've benefited from that over the last 50 years.
Great. So, Vint, thank you for this entertaining, informative evening. I'm so happy we could have you here and you could answer all the questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for letting me come and chew into your evening. I hope this was interesting for you, but in any case, if you have some ideas to solve some of the problems we talked about, don't be shy about sharing the ideas, please.
Thank you so much.